today we are here with Elizabeth Leake, professor of Italian literature and cinema at Columbia University, and we are here in order to talk of her last book, Tex Willer, Un cowboy nell'Italia del dopoguerra, or like Tex Willer, a cowboy in post-war Italy. I guess that my first question for you is, how did it came the interest of Tex Willer or comics in general?
Well, as you know, I teach 20th century literature and cinema at Columbia, and I'm especially interested in the period right after the war. This is such an important period in Italy, a period of great delicacy in terms of transitions. Now it's a period of amnesty, a period of reconciliation, and a period of reconstruction. Not just infrastructural, but also legislative and emotional. And one of the arguments in this book is that Tex offers a model for a kind of form of evasion that allows Italians to rest for a moment from this very arduous labor of reconstruction that they're undertaking.
Yeah, but as the conclusion of your book, it was not just a moment of restoration and like recreation, but you talk even about the building of Italian heroism. And would you like to talk in a more detailed way about this kind of new heroism that was shaped?
Sure. So, I mean, when we think about Tex in recent years, we think about him as very politically correct, except for the fact that he eats a lot of beef and potatoes. He's not a vegetarian, but we think about him as someone who's always on the side of the oppressed, who's always on the side of the underdog, who would never kill an Indian, who would never harm a woman. But in fact, Tex in 1948 was a very, very ambivalent character. He was outside of the law for much of his career, let's put it that way. Sometimes he was a ranger, sometimes he wasn't. And aside from the question of the law, he really did mostly whatever he wanted. He was very politically incorrect. He set forest fires. He shot a lot of horses. He ate a lot of horses, although that's a cultural thing that we don't necessarily need to call negative. He slaps women. He picks fights. He's permaloso. He's very sensitive in some ways to certain kinds of insults. So at the beginning, he's not much of a hero, but that doesn't mean he's not a model. I think that many Italian men in 1948, and women as well, but his big readership was masculine, were able to enjoy in that ethical ambivalence a kind of space for nostalgia, where violence could be inflicted with impunity, where you could do what you wanted and you didn't have to explain yourself to anybody, and where the past stayed in the past. The question of heroism comes out later, I think.
Okay, but the first number, like the number of Tex was 1948,
yes,
right?
Yeah.
So I think like the relation with fascism was a very delicate point. And as you mentioned, one of the characteristics of Tex was like his strength and his willingness and the masculinity as well. And how Gallup make it works to like not direct refer or to recall fascism, because like it was a taboo, I guess, at that time, and but at the same time proponing this character to a big audience.
Right. Well, I don't think Bonelli and Gallup had a specific program in mind. I think they were breathing the air around them. They were observing the zeitgeist, and they were pulling stories sort of from the ether in much the same way that Calvino talks about, say, in his preface to The Past of the Nest of Spiders. And so they were just reflecting on the environment that they found around them. I don't think they had any particular political agenda. On the contrary, I'm sure they didn't. And nor were they brand new at this job. They had been making comics and drawing for years and years and years at that point. They had to sell. They had to sell something. Okukupo didn't work out as they expected it to, and so this was a success, most unexpected, but a success that I think emerged quite organically from the spirit of the times.
And I have another question related not as much with the content of Tex, but about the media in itself, like comics, because if I remember well, around 1960, he started spaghetti western in Italian cinema. And Sergio Leone, of course, was one of the main figures. Do you know if the comics influenced the cinema, if the movie influenced the comics, if it was like a conversation? or?
I think it's a conversation, like with all media. They're always in dialogue, it seems to me, some more, some less. But we know from the very beginning, right from the inception of the comic strip, that Bonelli was very interested in film, and the number of film stars who perform sort of walk-ons, if you want, although as other characters in Tex, I think, speaks very eloquently to the influence of cinema in Bonelli and Gallup's work.
And do you think the same kind of heroism was proposed even from film, or was just something very related with Tex and the comic strips?
How do you mean?
But you talk about like heroism and the building of a new Italian man, and the ability to refer to even sociological problem or cultural problem that neorealism faces in 1948, 1950, but in a very different way, like resetting in US basically, and not try to represent reality, and Sergio Leone can be assumed or adopted at a strategy very similar to Tex. But do you think that Tex was more meaningful somehow in this process of reconstruction instead of Sergio Leone's film?
Well, the protagonists of Sergio Leone's films are deeply, deeply cynical. I think more cynical than Tex ever was. I think we have to be careful too when we think about the word heroism. I mean, I think what Tex does is he returns a sense of dignity to a certain kind of figure of Italian masculinity. Which doesn't mean that he, like we said earlier, it doesn't mean he's always on the right side of the law. It doesn't mean that he's a Boy Scout. On the contrary, and nor does he really, in that sense, resemble the traditional Western hero. And here, just as you were careful to say, things change in the 1960s. The Western changes in the 1960s and later as well. At that point, it's a genre that's been being created that's been in circulation for 80 years. So when we talk about the Western, we have to be careful. But in general, the Western character is very Manichaean. Right? They're the ones in the white hats. They're the ones in the black hats. They're the ones who behave well. They're the ones who shoot rabbits and abscond with the virgin nieces of the owner of the gold mine. Right? Tex again is very, very ethically ambivalent for a very long time. He only becomes gains spessore, much later in the game.
Yeah, and I think that the ambivalence is one of the characteristics that make art. Like otherwise, if it's just black and white, it's so like didascalic and direct that doesn't engage that much with the reader.
Exactly, and I think this is one of the great appeals of his character. Right, he can do all these things without having to account for them. Right, after the war, what a relief not to have to explain where you were. It's not by accident that he's a ranger either, because the rangers too, historically, by and large, sat out the Civil War. Which is fantastic when you think about the model that they offer for an Italy looking for a new space, a virgin space to conquer and to create the nation anew, in which to create the nation anew.
Okay, and talking about space, I'm very curious about the reception that your book has in academy, because like at least in Italian academy, comics are maybe not nowadays, but were considered like under literature or literature for childhood literature, so not very serious topics, so not something that is worth for academical stuff, let's say. How it's working in US and see.
Well, first of all, it's a trade book. I mean, it's there's stacks of it at Feltrinelli at La Centrale Milano. But having said that, Umberto Eco was working on comics in the 1960s. It's not particularly audacious a choice at this point to work on the comic. And in fact, in Italy, the reception has been very, very positive by and large. There have been a couple moments that have puzzled me. One was one critic, otherwise they've been, as I said, quite positive. One critic who was astonished that an American, I think what he meant was an American woman, would dare to teach the Italians about something so autochthonous. And the comparison he made was that it was like an Italian coming to New York to teach the Americans about hamburgers. But in point of fact, American scholars have been looking at Italy for a very long time, and vice versa. We welcome Italian scholars who look at American culture. The other thing I suppose to keep in mind is that the history of the last 50 years of sort of high criticism, academic criticism, produces example after example of the recuperation and the reevaluation of what was once considered low culture or pop culture. Think about, the great interest in television now or in digital media. YouTube videos are an object of legitimate study now in the academy. And I think that's the case in Italy as much as it is in the U.S.
Yeah. And will you encourage Italian scholar, like both, or from U.S. or from Italy or from wherever they want, to study comics, the Italian tradition of comics? And do you have like a method, an approach to suggest? Or
I think there's a lot of interesting work being produced in Italy in particular. But there too, my position is that the material produces or at least indicates in some sense the questions that will be most productive, and then we each bring our own intellectual interests to the project.
And another curiosity, there is an archive with the number of texts, or where did you find?
You'd be astonished at how many people have the entire collection.
Okay.
I couldn't shake a stick without running into someone who said, "Oh, I own the entire thing, and it's on my bedside stand." No, I read it every year. It's like the Bible. The number of people who own the entire collection and continue to read and reread and read and reread the collection is astonishing. So there was no difficulty finding the collection.
Okay,
Just bought it on
great.
eBay.
I didn't expect it. Yeah. And maybe the last question, because at some point in your book you mentioned that at the very beginning the drawing for the character of Tex was a little bit uglier than how it came at the end.
Right.
Do you know why it changed? If it were like closer to Occhio that was like the main plan for Gallup at the very beginning, and then they switched to
Plan? I don't think so. There are a couple possibilities, it seems to me. One is to think about the American cowboy hero in the 1930s, a figure with which Bonelli and Gallup would have been very familiar. They're not chiseled, masculine, good-looking. They're a little bit dumpy. They're cheerful boys who love to sing. Exactly. Yeah, they're not particularly physically adept, many of them. So that's a possibility. Also think about Italian films in the 1930s and early 40s. Gino Cervi, for example, is hardly a matinee idol. It's only later in fascism that Mussolini says, "Oh, could we have some better-looking heroes, some better-looking protagonists?" The other way to think about it is, Bonelli and Gallup are finding their way at this point. Their time is limited. They've got a lot of other projects. As we said, Occhio is their principal interest at the very beginning. And then as they have time to devote themselves more consistently to the Tex project, I think they start to think about producing a look that they want to continue to reproduce. The other thing that's funny especially about the early years, is they're so tired, these guys, poor lambs, that in order to stay awake, Gallup, for example, you will have noticed, draws these little tiny, totally irrelevant drawings in the margins of the comic. No, especially of coffee pots, le moche, or dogs and fire hydrants. Right, he's just trying to stay awake in the night. They work deep into the night to produce these comics in time for publication. And I think, as banal an anecdote as that is relevant to the argument here that this is the story of an Italy trying to reconstruct, trying to roll its sleeves up and build something, with this kind of crazy solution, but one that turns out to be very, very successful. When you think that the creator, that is to say the owner of the publishing house that initially produced Tex was Bonelli's ex-wife, and she had no experience with publishing, but she needed to feed her child. This is a wonderful story. This is Italian heroism, if you like.
Okay, nice. It was a pleasure to speak with you and to have this conversation.
Thank you.
And thanks very much to have written this book. And that's
pleasure was mine. Thank you.